Good morning. My name is Steve Kamerman. I am a PHP developer, software architect, infrastructure guy, and the co-founder of a company called Scientia Mobile. We're the guys that maintain the Whirlpool project, if you've ever heard of that. My business partner, Luca, spoke for the keynote yesterday. So I'm going to be talking about HipHop for PHP and how to get high-performance PHP and why you might want high-performance PHP, right? So Facebook is the quintessential large-scale PHP site, right? It gets tons of traffic. In 2008, it hit 100 million active users, and Facebook realized that they have a big problem. The problem is that they had explosive growth, and they didn't even have enough people to put servers in their racks fast enough to account for their growth rate. So they literally couldn't react to the amount of growth they were getting. So in the process, they profiled their whole site, and they realized that the problem was page generation. So some of their stuff was written in C++ already. They profiled MySQL. They profiled their load balancers and everything else involved and said, you know, what is slowing down our system? And they found that it was PHP. It was page generation. Not that it was PHP. It's not that it was PHP's fault. It's that every page view on Facebook is dynamic. So when you see even a fragment of a page, it might have your friends on it or comments from other people. And so they profiled their PHP and they said, what is it in PHP that's causing things to go so slow? And they found that 20% of the time spent in PHP was spent in native code. So you know, string position and these types of things, native calls that are already in C and C++, and they're already optimized. And the 80% that was remaining was all in interpreted code. So maybe iterating over some iterator or something like that. So their challenge was, how can we speed up that 80% of the time? And at the time, they realized that if they shrink that 80% down to 0, they'll only be left with the 20% in native code, and that would be a 5 times increase in speed if they could pull it off. So why is PHP so slow? Well, first of all, it's an interpreted language, so it's not like you're writing this in C and it's getting compiled down. So PHP uses symbol table lookups, which means that it uses a lot of symbol table lookups, which means that every variable you use or every function that you call ends up in pulling this big hash of all the possible variables that might exist in that scope, and then it goes and finds that variable, and then it goes and figures out where the memory is, and then it reads that memory and then returns the value. And that's only for one of the variables. If you have let's say you call a function that takes 4 arguments, the symbol table lookup occurs for both the function and each of the 4 arguments. And so this is very slow. PHP doesn't optimize this very much. Other interpreted languages like Python are far more efficient at this. It also doesn't have any static binding whatsoever. What that means is if you use a constant, there's no way for PHP to guarantee the value of that constant. And so in a normal language, in a normal compiled language, you would replace the variable name at compile time with the value of the variable. Since it's constant, it can't ever change. There's no point in going to look up its value. But PHP still references the symbol table for constants. So that's another problem. To complicate matters, we have dynamic typing in PHP. So even in an opcode cache, you can't infer the type of a variable or guarantee that it will stay the same. So you might have a variable called foo. It might be a string at this moment and an int in the next. And we'll get into a little bit more about why that's particularly problemsome in PHP. And then lastly is the shared nothing architecture of PHP. Some people say this is a terrible idea. Some people say it's a great idea. What it means is that nothing is shared across requests, except maybe the session or something you store in some other cache. And so every time a request comes in, it needs to completely regenerate all the objects. Everything needs to be reinstantiated, right? And that's expensive. The benefit of shared nothing architecture is that you can scale horizontally. You can throw 1,000 more servers in, and it will pick up the load, albeit a little more slowly. Some people continue to argue with me about whether shared nothing architecture is a good idea, but then I would point them to the example of Python. In Python, the most common framework, as far as I know, is Django. And Django actually re-engineered itself to prevent sharing information because normally information is persisted across requests, and they went out of their way to destroy everything every time so they could have this shared nothing architecture. So that's an example of someone that came with the shared everything and went back to shared nothing. So in 2008 to 2010, Facebook was trying to solve this problem of their traffic, right? I said they had 100 million active users, and they were reaching 400 billion PHP-generated page views per month. That's a hell of a lot of page views. That's 154,000 page views per second. If you had 1,000 servers, that's 154 page views per second per server across 1,000 servers. So that's an absolutely astronomical number. And part of the reason is that for each visit, you might cause 10 or 20 page views, so to speak, HTTP requests, because it's lazily loaded with AJAX and things. So Facebook invented something called HipHop for PHP, and they deployed it in 2010 to fix their performance problem. So you can see the first red line is the previous graph that I had shown. They're at 100 million active users, and they went up in 2010. They had increased their traffic by a factor of 6. These are active users, too. These aren't just people that register and don't use it. So my grandmother would not fall in this list, probably. But and then I'll get into what HipHop did for them, but you can see their traffic has gone up to the point where they're doing over 1 billion active users now. So what is HipHop for PHP? HipHop for PHP is a multi-threaded embedded web server with a built-in PHP runtime. And so typically you have the Zend PHP runtime, which you install like anything else. But HipHop replaces the PHP runtime and optimizes it. There were 2 different generations of HipHop for PHP. There was HPHPC, which literally translates PHP into C++, and I'll get more in detail on that. And there's HHVM, which is the new generation. That's called the HipHop Virtual Machine, and it runs. I'll talk more about it in a bit. Typically, you see a 2 to 5 times speed increase over stock PHP plus APC. Now, this was a stat that came prior to PHP 5.5 with opcache. It came prior to PHP 5.4 as well, so there's actually been a significant increase in PHP itself. To give you an idea, when they deployed it, Facebook immediately saw a 2x increase in speed, and now they get a 9x increase in speed, but they do a couple other things to cheat the system to make things faster. HipHop for PHP compiler. This is the first generation. I started using HipHop. Oh, by the way, I'm not affiliated with Facebook. I don't develop HipHop. I have no vested interest in this other than it making my services faster. So I started using HipHop 18 months ago, and it was in this stage of HPHPC, which means that it translates every line for line from PHP into C++, human-readable C++. And in doing so, it actually keeps the same class names that you had in PHP in the C++ side. So in Facebook, this created a very interesting opportunity for them. They could compile their PHP code in the front end and then reuse those same classes in C++ in the back end with their server guys. So dynamic typing makes downcompiling PHP into C++ very difficult. So if you imagine you had a function called foo, and it takes a variable called bar, right? This function, there's no way to guarantee the type of the parameter that you pass it. So if you turn it into C++, what variable type do you use for the parameter? So they came up with this. Actually, PHP itself has, as far as I know, has this concept of a variant, which is a variable that can represent any possible variable type in PHP. But that's not really efficient. So if there's some way for the code to infer, let's say the parameter that you pass to this function foo, you initialize as an integer. You could be reasonably sure that at some point that function will get called with this integer. And so HipHop would actually create 2 functions. It would create one that takes a variant and one that takes an integer. And because of C++ and overloading it, the function that gets called is dependent on the variables that get passed to it. So it can make for some very fast code. Function parity is a big problem, was a big problem with the first generation of HipHop because not all the functions were implemented. Things like eval and goto didn't make sense in the first place, and they definitely don't make sense in C++. And there were a lot of extensions that were not compiled. So every extension, one by one, had to be transitioned from normal PHP to HipHop for PHP, and that's a difficult process. As an example, MySQLi is not available even today on HipHop for PHP. The original MySQL is, and PDO is, but Facebook had no reason to port MySQLi, so they never did it. So the biggest problem that I saw with HPHPC is the long compilation time. My project, which was fairly small, it was a web service that I'll talk about in a little bit, took about 10 minutes to compile. Literally to compile the PHP down to C++, and then I need to start the server, maybe run some PHP unit against it to make sure it still works, and then hope for the best. But Facebook took 20 minutes to compile their code base, but it was over 100 build machines. So as you can imagine, any change they make that has to get pushed to production takes hundreds of hours or hundreds of minutes of compilation across their build cluster. So what we did was, the reason we use this is, first of all, Facebook is one of my customers, and so we need to make sure that whatever we do is compatible with Facebook's infrastructure. And secondly, we created a cloud service called Whirlpool Cloud, which is a mobile device detection service. So you pass us an HTTP request, and we pass you back a JSON object that contains the properties of the device, like screen resolution and which types of media it can play and that sort of thing. And so this had to be very fast. So people would use this on their website, and it would actually have to make a call to our cloud and then come back before it could even generate the page. So that could cause a serious bottleneck for our customers. So we need to be very, very low latency. So we checked out HipHop. I checked out a couple of other technologies. And we decided to use HipHop because on Apache, the latency for a typical request to my service was about 20 milliseconds. Well, the entire duration of the generation, page generation. And with HipHop, it was 2 milliseconds. So that's a 10 times improvement in speed for me. It's not because HipHop was 10 times faster at processing the PHP necessarily, but it was a lot less overhead because my PHP code base literally was turned into a web server. So it was much more efficient. Now, it did have some stability issues, and I had to craft a creative way to avoid them. So what I did was we use HAProxy, the load balancer, in front of our servers. These Whirlpool nodes are individual virtual machines that are serving traffic for our web service, and the load balancer is just balancing out traffic to each of them. But since HipHop for PHP was relatively unstable when we started, I had to run both HipHop and Apache, and I pointed the document route for both of those at the same code base. So they both serve the same code, but of course one is compiled and one is not. And so if HipHop were to fail, I would fail over to Apache with a load balancer. Now, to deal with the long compilation times that I talked about, it takes about 10 minutes for us to compile our code base. I wrote an API called HAProxy API, which is an open source PHP-based API that you can download if you want. And it allows me to do things like connect to a load balancer, disable a server under that load balancer, get some statistics on the load balancer to make sure that there's enough nodes to carry the burden if I were to turn one off, and then I can re-enable servers and this sort of thing. So we scripted the whole thing. It would go one server at a time, recompiling our code base. 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and a couple hours later, or an hour and a half later, hopefully all was well. So the next generation of HipHop is called HHVM, which is HipHop Virtual Machine. So unlike the previous version where you had to compile everything by hand down to C++ and then run that, HipHop Virtual Machine has an interpreter built in and a just-in-time compiler built in, and so it runs as a service on the system and iteratively compiles your code while it's running. So if you were to turn on HipHop or HHVM, it would be interpreting the PHP files and serving immediately, and in the process, it would nice in terms of CPU time, it would compile your code down to native code without this need for separate compilation. One interesting thing is that the bytecode cache survives a server restart. So unlike with PHP, unlike with APC, for example, or opcache for PHP 5.5, if you restart Apache or Nginx, then your bytecode goes away. But with HHVM, it survives in the form of a SQLite file that sits on the file system. Oh yeah, and I'm happy to take questions as I go. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'm happy to answer it for you. So this is some sort of an approximation of how HHVM works. We take a request in, It's received in the embedded web server, and if there's not already native code that's been generated for it, it runs it through the interpreter, which generates bytecode, and then runs the bytecode, and in a separate thread down compiles it into native code. And there's a warm-up phase in which it's spending some time watching how the PHP is actually executing and doing type inference to say, like, what did your variable end up turning into? I expected it to be an int, but maybe it's a string, and it can do that for us. Okay, so what kind of performance differences do we see between HHVM and HipHop and HPHPC? So this is what Facebook found out, that the baseline here, 100%, is the previous generation, HPHPC, and the yellow line represents HHVM. And so comparatively, they introduced it early on, but it was slow because of this iterative down-compiling stuff. It took a while for them to catch up, but in 2012, they reached the same speed as HPHPC, and they deployed it on their servers. I believe it was at the beginning of the year in 2013. This IR stands for intermediate representation, and it's sort of like a very fast bytecode like Java or .NET would turn it into, so it can be run by the VM. So optimizing PHP, what can you do in your PHP code to make HipHop faster? Well, first of all, you need to think about type inference. This is what the compiler does to try to, like we say, optimize functions specifically for the types of variables you're passing in. What that means is you need to try to make an effort to keep your variables the same type. Now that presents a bit of a problem with PHP because most of the core functions, or many of the core functions, return bool false on failure, even though they might otherwise return an integer. For example, string position will return an int if it finds the string, the needle in the haystack, but if it doesn't, it'll return bool false. And that destroys the type inference. I mean, it destroys your variable type, and now the compiler can't assume it's going to stay an int anymore. So you do the best you can, basically. HHVM upgrades primitives. This means that if your variable started as an int, it may need to get upgraded to a variant because it got changed somewhere along the line into a string. And use strict comparison. That's important anyway. In fact, I'd say when my developers don't use strict comparison, it drives me nuts, and I'll show you a couple of reasons why. I'll let you take a few minutes to read through some of these examples to see the craziness of PHP. Some of my favorites are false equals true, and this using string position as a bool, and that's a terrible mistake that a lot of people make. Or using a string as an integer. Ironically, this is not the same, even though this is, but so. Okay, avoiding the global scope. This is really important because in PHP, everyone can access the global scope. So you can just throw some random code in a PHP file and run it outside of any function or class, but there's no guarantee that your variables aren't going to get overwritten. It can get overwritten by something out of band too. So let's say you have an exception handler, and you initialize a variable as 1, and then somewhere along the line you print out that variable and expect it to be 1. Well, in the process, you may have thrown an exception, and in your exception handler, you may have modified the global scope. You could have changed that variable from 1 to b, and now all of a sudden the type has changed. And so there's no way for the compiler to know during static analysis that your variable has retained its type. So you can, if you have to, you can wrap your code to get it outside of the global scope. That way it can't be messed with outside of the function. But a better approach is just not to write crappy code. So, so unique classes, functions, and constants. This is important because although in PHP you can't have 2 classes with the same name at the same time, you can certainly have more than one definition for a class. For example, I was working on a website that had a user class. It was a model that represented the user table in the database. And then I had to do some single sign-on integration. And so with PHPBB, and I loaded up PHPBB's library to poke in my user, and I found out PHPBB also has a user class. and that causes a runtime error. So now I need to make really nasty curl calls across local hosts to be able to interact with another service. So I don't know why the Facebook team seems to be a little bit adverse to namespaces, but I personally think they're a great idea, and HHVM supports them, so my recommendation is use namespaces. Another good side effect is that your code won't work with really old versions of PHP that might not do what you want anyway. So if you have the class bar in two different namespaces, they're not obviously ambiguous. They're unique because they have their namespace. So I like to call this concept of in PHP there's no real constants unless it's a class constant. So I call this dynamic constants when you use define, because you can define something that's supposed to be constant based on an expression, or you could say if this, then define as that, if that, then define as this. But it really defeats the whole purpose of a constant, because a constant is never changing. So you've conditionally made a read-only variable, I guess you could say, but the compiler can't determine what that variable type will be statically, so it has to watch your code to figure that out, and there's no guarantee that it's going to stay. Well, there is a guarantee that it'll stay the same after it's been defined. There's no guarantee as to how you're going to define it, right? And I can almost picture a request for undefine and redefine, and in fact, I bet you I could find somebody on Stack Overflow that's asked how you redefine something. If they're truly constant, use a const. And here's an example, really simply, of using these types of constants are constant forever. This will always and ever be I'm a real constant on my app config. And if you really need this sort of like conditionally defined constant, then stick it in some private storage and use it as a registry or something like that. That is assuming you don't want to use dependency injection and things. Dynamic variables are a travesty. Has anybody actually used dynamic variables like this with double dollar signs before? For any, what's that?
Not in productive environments, but
okay.
For
playing. Yeah, right. I've personally never found a use for them. I mean, I can see the use for a dynamic when you're accessing a property dynamically. So you build the property name of a class dynamically and then go and fetch it. But dynamic variables, no, I don't use them. It's bad. It's bad news. So the problem is that the compiler can't figure out what variable you're talking to because it depends on a previous expression, and there's no way to know. Extract and compact are difficult for HipHop for PHP as well because they both mess with the local scope. And so HipHop doesn't try to keep track of which variables are in the local scope explicitly. So if you call extract, it has to unpack this array into the local scope, and then it has to make sure it's not overwriting things, and that can change the variable types of existing variables. And similarly, compact will rip things out of the local scope, and that's expensive to do. Okay. So get defined vars. Has anybody used this before? Outside of testing? This is bad. Don't use this. I would suggest if you're using get defined vars for non-testing code, then you should rewrite it before somebody sees it. If you don't know what it does, it pulls out everything from the local scope so you can look at all the variables that are currently defined. But it's extremely expensive to do this, even for normal PHP. Declaring class properties. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't declare a class property unless you have some sort of generic object that's there just to store data. And so if that's your case, that you're actually just storing data on a generic object, that's fine. But generally speaking, you shouldn't use undeclared properties. And if you're not seeing PHP notices, then you should be turning on PHP notices because these are things you shouldn't be doing in the first place. Another neat thing that HipHop does is it optimizes getters. So if you have a function that does nothing but goes and gets the value of a property and returns it, that is called a getter, and it's fairly inefficient in normal PHP because accessing a property directly skips the whole round trip through the function. But there's no way to make a read-only variable, so to speak, in PHP. So if you make a getter, it gets down-compiled in HipHop for PHP into sort of read-only property. And it's the same amount of machine instructions to access a getter as it is to access a real property. So what's the performance gain? The performance gain is less than 5% by using the different maintaining type types and things like that. But it's still good practice anyway. Some suboptimal functions still work, even eval and goto in HHVM. So you might think I went hunting for this comic on the internet, trying to find something good for my slide, but I did not. I found this on PHP's manual on the goto documentation. So it's an example of why you don't use goto right here, because a dinosaur can come and tackle your computer. So there's another mode. There's a mode in HipHop for PHP that allows you to increase performance very easily. You turn it on. It's called repo authoritative mode, and it means that once the files in your document root have been evaluated, it assumes they've never changed. And so it's sort of like APC stat equals 0, where it doesn't go back to make I/O calls to see if your PHP files have changed. Otherwise, it normally behaves just like PHP. If you change a file, that file will be immediately processed and used in execution. The only thing that I've found kind of annoying about this is that you have to manually delete the cache that HipHop creates. Because if you recall, I said that the opcode cache is stored between restarts. It doesn't die with the server. So when you restart the service, it'll keep using the old data. So you need to delete the old cache and reanalyze it. And I'm assuming that after Facebook sees me presenting this, they'll want to make a good tutorial on how to do this nicely, because I haven't been able to figure it out very easily. Okay, so the current state of HipHop. HHVM 2.2.0 was just released on October 17, and it's very close in function parity to PHP 5.4. There were some old functions that they never felt like porting, like string get CSV or something like that, getting like parsing a CSV string into an array. They finally ported this thing over. They've brought in the internationalization extension, which previously precluded you from using the Zen Framework 2 on HipHop because it required that extension. And they've brought in a bunch more extensions that are fairly obscure. Now the performance of HHVM is nearly five times that of normal PHP for a typical application. Now I'm quoting Facebook, so take it for what it's worth. The goal for Facebook is to support the top 20 frameworks by the end of 2013. And so they've created a chart of the current state of support. So this is the number of the percentage of unit tests that pass per framework for the top, frameworks that it's in order of most popular framework on GitHub. Actually, I'm sorry, I've reordered it into the order of its percentage of passing. But anyway, so if you take, for example, Drupal passes 98% of the unit tests. Now, I didn't think that was terribly great, to be honest with you. I use the Yi framework quite a bit, or I did, and 92% doesn't really give me a whole lot of confidence in the program. But then if you actually take PHP and run the real runtime against it, you find that it's not much better than that. So PHP itself from Zend only passes 95% plus of the unit tests for most of these frameworks. Now the ones in red couldn't be run at all because there's some problem. For example, in what was it in Cake PHP? I don't remember. In Zen Framework 2, they didn't have the internationalization plugin. Extension. It's since been added, so it'll work now. PHPBB, throughout the entire unit test, they call a function missing a parameter, and that is an error in HipHop, and it can't be done. So it simply fails, and that's similar with the rest of these. So I believe that HipHop for PHP is open source because there's so much PHP code that gets merged into it that they have this intrinsic connection to the PHP license. So they licensed it itself under the PHP license, which is a fairly liberal license. It's not real restrictive. I had an issue in 2011 where they stopped committing to their repository, and I was concerned that maybe they're not going to continue giving back to the community. And so so there was a 6-month period where I was a little bit on edge. In addition, there were some problems with functions. I've submitted I don't even know, 4 or 5 bug requests or bug reports to the GitHub HipHop for PHP repository. One just got fixed last week for me, and I think that speaking about it helps. So, so now it's under active development. I see regularly 50, 60, 70 commits per day on the public GitHub repository. They're not like pooling them and then pushing them to GitHub. They're actually doing it in real time. And the development team themselves is active on IRC. I've jumped on there quite a few times and just chatted with these guys. These guys are the ones that are developing the actual HipHop for PHP. So you can go in there and suggest something, see what's coming up, and that sort of thing. So like I said, I was a little bit distraught in 2011 when this activity slowed down. And so I happened to know a few people at Facebook, and I went and I asked them, what the heck is going on here? You know, is Facebook committed to this thing? And so I got a quote from James Pierce, which was, he's the head of developer advocacy at Facebook. He's a nice guy. I mean, I know him outside of Facebook as well. And he said that in years past, we've had a few examples of projects which have not been well supported, but we are now much better at growing and sustaining community projects, including lately in mobile. HipHop for PHP is absolutely a project that we stand strongly behind, so stay tuned. So that makes me feel a little better, but I still would say that its connection to the PHP license would be the most compelling reason to trust HipHop for PHP. So let's see here. So I've got a list of references that you can check out. I think the presentation will be made available on the website, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't get into, actually I've got some more time, so let me talk briefly about this. Sebastian Bergman is here. You may have seen some of his talks already at the conference. And he wrote something called HHVM wrapper. It's available on GitHub. And what it does is, since HHVM has to go into such depth in the PHP code to try to figure things out, like variable types, it learns a lot of things about the code you write in the process. And it can learn a lot of issues that are, or potential issues that you have in your code base. And so, so Sebastian has written this HHVM wrapper, which does static analysis on your PHP code base and figures out, you know, what's wrong with your variable types and this type of thing, and reports them back. I think HHVM makes it available in JSON, and it gets parsed by the HHVM wrapper. So I asked him about this, and he was very, he's got something coming up that he wasn't telling me about. So we'll have to see what he's coming up with. Yep, and if you want to see, if you'd like to know more about how the actual transition from PHP into C++ works, Haiping Zhao, the original developer from Facebook, has done a really in-depth look. He did a lecture at Stanford University for an hour and a half talking about how you turn PHP into C++, because it's not an easy task. Okay, Facebook actually tests HipHop for PHP against WordPress because it has a very, how do you say it, diverse set of code behind it. Actually, it's really crappy code, but anyway, yeah. So it's a great test bed for the code base. So I think one of the biggest problems with when you have performance problems with PHP, it's probably because you have a framework that's instantiating 1,000 objects every time you get a request, right? And so if you're not using an opcode cache, you should be using one. Now, I understand APC has a lot of issues with PHP 5.4, but I've tested opcache on PHP 5.5, and it's extremely fast. I mean, even without using HipHop, you should be doing that because this reinstantiation is very expensive. So how many of you had heard of HipHop prior to this meeting? Everybody, almost. Okay. For me, it took usually about an hour if I had the dependencies, but the dependencies are so specific. For example, you have to get this exact version of memcache, and then on top of that, you have to pull Facebook's patch file, the diff patch file, and apply it to the memcache library, and then compile that in, and it's really nasty. It took, you know, it would take hours to get it working right if you can get it working right. Now, with HHVM, I think with the introduction of 2.2.0 a week and a half ago, they have packages available for all the Red Hat-based, you know, Fedora, CentOS, and as well as Debian and Ubuntu, and I don't remember what the last one was. I can check, though. Actually, here, I'll just, I was going to, well, it's okay. Well, anyway, I can check for you afterwards. Well then, thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.